Mountain Man was forced to marry an obese stranger. That's how the church crowd will remember it. Snow drifting through the open door, the sheriff's boots echoing on the wood floor, and a giant in buckskin standing stiff before the altar. He didn't ask for a wife, and she didn't ask for a husband. But in the lamplight, vows were spoken like a sentence passed. What no one knew was the ground under her late brother's farm hides the valley's purest spring water. A greedy company would kill to control. The sheriff calls it justice. She calls it survival. Now the mountains are closing in with winter's grip. Fence posts appear where none should be. Strangers watch from the ridge. And between the wind and the silence, there's a truth neither of them has dared speak. When the snow melts and the guns come out, will he walk away from the woman he never wanted, or stand and fight for the one he might not be able to live without? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The pine boards of the little church creaked under the weight of whispers and stares. Agnes Pruitt stood straight-backed beside the altar, her brown wool dress dusted with snow, refusing to let her shoulders slump despite the weight of every eye upon her. The bitter February wind howled outside, making the window frames rattle like dry bones. Elias Grant's face might have been carved from the mountain stone he'd spent the past week hunting across. His buckskin vest showed wear at the shoulders, and his wool shirt carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Only the slight twitch of his jaw betrayed any emotion as Sheriff Reddick's hand stayed firmly clamped on his arm. By the authority vested in me, Preacher Morris began, his voice wavering. We are gathered here today. The words blurred together in Agnes's mind as she stole glances at the stranger who was about to become her husband. His dark eyes stayed fixed on some distant point, as if he could see straight through the church's whitewashed walls to the freedom of his beloved mountains. Sheriff Reddick cleared his throat meaningfully when Elias remained silent at the crucial moment. Those taxes won't pay themselves, Grant, he drawled, just loud enough for the front pews to hear. Might be time in the jail would help you reconsider. Elias's shoulders stiffened. I do, he ground out, the words falling like stones between them. Agnes's own I do came out steadier than she'd feared, though her hands trembled around the worn handle of her carpet bag. She lifted her chin, meeting the curious and pitying stares of the townsfolk with quiet dignity. This wasn't how she'd imagined her wedding day, but if it would protect her brother's spring, she would endure it. I now pronounce you man and wife, Preacher Morris concluded hastily, clearly eager to be done with the uncomfortable affair. The whispers grew louder as Elias turned without a word and strode toward the door. Agnes hurried to keep up with his long steps, her carpetbag bouncing against her skirts. The cold hit her like a slap as they stepped outside, and she pulled her worn shawl tighter. This way, Elias said shortly, the first words he'd spoken directly to her. He led her to the parsonage kitchen, a small room warmed by a pot-bellied stove. The smell of beans and cornbread filled the air, but neither of them moved toward the food. Agnes set her carpetbag down carefully and gathered her courage. They told me this marriage would protect my brother's land, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The spring especially. It's all I have left of him. Elias stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense as he watched snow begin to fall. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Finally, he turned, and Agnes saw something shift in his expression, not softening exactly, but perhaps understanding. Your brother's spring, he said slowly. The one that feeds the creek through town? Agnes nodded. James homesteaded that land fair and square. Worked it for 5 years before the fever took him. She swallowed hard. Sheriff Reddick said there were men trying to claim it, that a married woman would have better standing to keep it. And now here we are, Elias said grimly. caught in Reddick's trap like two full rabbits. The beans bubbled on the stove, forgotten. Outside, the wind howled louder, driving snow against the windows in white sheets. Agnes watched her new husband's face, trying to read the thoughts behind those guarded eyes. He was a handsome man, she had to admit, in a wild sort of way. All angles and weathered skin and careful stillness. "I won't be a burden to you," she said firmly. "I can cook, keep house, shoot straight if need be. James taught me that much before he passed." Elias turned from the window fully then, studying her with those dark eyes. Reddick's got his fingers in everything in this town, he said finally. If he wanted this marriage, it wasn't to help either of us. "I reckon not," Agnes agreed, her voice soft but determined. "But here we are all the same." The supper grew cold on the stove as Elias considered their situation, his expression thoughtful. Agnes waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knowing that whatever came next would shape both their futures. The kitchen grew darker as the storm outside intensified, shadows deepening in the corners of the room. The only sounds were the howl of the wind, the tick of the clock on the wall, and the occasional pop from the stove's dying fire. In this forced quiet, two strangers bound by law and circumstance tried to make sense of the trap they'd found themselves in, each wondering what tomorrow might bring. The snow swirled in delicate flurries as Elias led the way to the church's small stable. His mule stamped impatiently in its stall, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air. Agnes stood in the doorway, clutching her carpet bag with white-knuckled fingers, her threadbare coat offering little protection against the mountain. Cold Elias worked efficiently, checking the mule's hooves for ice before securing the saddle. He could feel Agnes watching him, but kept his focus on the task. The leather creaked as he tightened the cinch. Familiar sounds in an unfamiliar situation. "It's a fair distance," he said finally, turning to face her. "Road's icy. We'll need to take it slow." Agnes nodded, her face pale but determined. "I'm not afraid of a hard ride." The ghost of a smile touched Elias's lips. "Reckon we'll see about that." He helped her mount, noting how she settled into the saddle with practiced ease, then took the lead rope and started them down the rutted road leading out of town. The afternoon light was already growing thin, filtered through heavy clouds. Their progress was slow, the mule picking its way carefully over the frozen ground. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves on snow and the whisper of wind through bare branches. After about an hour, Agnes spoke softly. "James, my brother, he loved that spring. Said it was the sweetest water he'd ever tasted." Her voice caught slightly. "When the fever took him last fall, I promised I'd keep it safe. But then the mining company started sending men around, talking about water rights." Elias kept his eyes on the trail but listened. "Mining companies been buying up every water source they can get their hands on. They offered money first," Agnes continued, her words coming faster now. "When I refused, they started making threats. Said a woman alone had no business trying to hold on to such valuable property." She paused. "That's when Sheriff Reddick suggested this arrangement." "Reddick's got his own interests," Elias said shortly. "Usually lines up with whoever's got the deepest pockets." They fell silent again as the trail narrowed, winding higher into the foothills. The temperature dropped steadily with the sun, and Elias could hear Agnes trying to suppress her shivering. Just as dusk was settling in, his cabin came into view, a simple one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney jutting from the roof. Elias helped Agnes dismount, her fingers stiff with cold as they gripped his shoulder. Inside, he moved with practiced efficiency, striking a match to light the oil lamp while Agnes stood just inside the door, taking in the sparse furnishings. A narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a stone hearth with a black iron pot hanging above it. "Need to get a fire going," Elias muttered, more to himself than to her. He stacked kindling and smaller logs, soon having a decent blaze crackling in the hearth. Without a word, he took his heavy wool blanket from the bed and handed it to Agnes, who wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully. From a wooden box near the hearth, he pulled out a slab of salt pork and began slicing it. To his surprise, Agnes stepped forward, drawing a sharp knife from her carpetbag. "Let me help," she said firmly, and before he could object, she was beside him, her knife work quick and sure. James always said I had a steady hand with a blade. They worked in companionable silence, the pork sizzling in the iron skillet, when suddenly the sound of hoofbeats crunched through the snow outside. Elias moved instantly, grabbing his Winchester from its place beside the door. "Stay back," he told Agnes, but before he could open the door, a familiar voice called out, "Elias Grant, I would speak with you." Elias's shoulders relaxed slightly, though he kept the rifle ready. "Tawa," he said to Agnes. "He's a friend." He stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. The elderly Ute sat straight-backed on his pony, his face weathered as old leather in the gathering darkness. "I heard in town you took a wife today," he said without preamble. "Not by choice," Elias replied. "Sheriff's doing." Tawa nodded slowly. "The woman, she is sister to James." "Pruitt? You knew him?" "You knew him?" "I knew of him, and I know of the spring he claimed." Tawa's dark eyes were serious in the deepening twilight. "That water comes from sacred ground, promised to my people by treaty long ago. Many have forgotten, but the Ute remember." He paused, considering his next words carefully. The mining company would drain it dry, poison it with their operations. But a proper land claim, held by a married woman of good character. He left the implication hanging. Elias absorbed this in silence, his mind churning with the new information. The spring's importance went beyond just water rights and mining claims. It was part of something older, something that deserved protecting. Tawa gathered his reins. "Think on what I have said, my friend. Sometimes the Great Spirit works in ways we do not expect." With a slight nod, he turned his pony and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Elias standing on the porch with snow settling on his shoulders and questions stirring in his mind. When he stepped back inside, Agnes looked up from where she was tending the skillet. "Is everything all right?" Elias set his Winchester back in its place, his movements deliberate as he considered how much to share. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the small cabin, while outside, the snow continued to fall in silent flurries. The pale morning light filtered through frost-rimmed windows, casting delicate patterns across the cabin's wooden floor. Elias blinked awake to the sounds of crackling wood and the rich aroma of coffee. Agnes stood at the hearth, her broad frame silhouetted against the firelight as she carefully stoked the embers with an iron poker. He'd given her the narrow bed last night, making his own bed on the floor with his bedroll. Now he watched as she moved with quiet efficiency, her movements sure despite the unfamiliar surroundings. "Coffee's nearly ready," she said without turning around. "Found your pot and beans in the cupboard. Hope you don't mind." Elias sat up, running a hand through his sleep-mussed hair. "Much obliged." He paused, then added, "You didn't have to do that. I'm used to early mornings." Agnes poured the steaming coffee into 2 tin cups. "And I wanted to ask, what did Tawa want last night?" Elias accepted the cup she offered, wrapping his calloused hands around its warmth. Steam rose between them as he considered his words carefully. The spring, it's on sacred ground, protected by old treaties with the Ute. Agnes settled into the room's other chair, her face growing serious. James never mentioned that. Most folks don't know, or don't care to remember. Elias took a slow sip of coffee. Tawa says the mining company would destroy it, drain it dry, and as his jaw set in a determined line. Then we have even more reason to protect it. She glanced out the frosted window. I'd like to see it, the spring, if you'll show me. Elias nodded. We can head out before noon. Snow's deep, though I can manage. True to her word, Agnes kept pace as they made their way through the snow-laden forest. Her breaths came out in white puffs, and her cheeks were pink with cold, but she didn't complain as they navigated the deep drifts. Elias found himself adjusting his stride to match hers. Impressed by her determination, the morning sun had risen higher by the time they reached the spring. A circle of ancient cedars stood guard around it, their branches heavy with snow. The water itself lay partially frozen, a sheet of ice covering its surface except for the center where the spring bubbled up from deep underground. Elias knelt at the edge, using the handle of his knife to break through the thin ice. Clear water welled up, pristine and pure. He cupped some in his hands, offering it to Agnes. She knelt beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as she dipped her hands into the icy water. After taking a sip, her eyes widened. It's so sweet, she whispered. James used to bring me, here in summer, when the wildflowers bloomed all around. Her voice grew soft with memory. Now I understand why he loved it so, why it's worth fighting for. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle gurgle of water against ice. The sun had reached its peak when Elias finally stood, offering Agnes his hand. As they began their return journey, something caught his eye, a flash of red against the white snow. Wait, he said, moving closer to investigate. A wooden stake had been driven into the frozen ground, a strip of red cloth tied to its top. Another was visible about 50 paces away. Survey stakes, Agnes said, her voice tight. The mining company is already starting to map the land. Elias's jaw clenched. They're moving fast, faster than I expected. The discovery cast a shadow over their trek back to the cabin. By the time they returned, the short winter day was already fading. Agnes busied herself with preparing the rabbit Elias had caught the previous day, while he built up the fire against the coming night. The stew bubbled in his pot, filling the small cabin with savory aromas. As they sat down to eat, Elias cleared his throat. Those stakes mean trouble's coming. We'll have to stand together, even if this arrangement between us is temporary. Agnes stirred her stew, not meeting his eyes. I hope, she said quietly, then seemed to gather her courage. I hope it's more than temporary. The words hung in the air between them, as delicate as the frost patterns on the windows. Elias found himself studying her face in the firelight, the quiet strength in her features, the determination that matched his own. For the first time since their forced marriage, he felt something shift in his chest, like ice beginning to thaw. The evening settled around them as they finished their meal, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead and the unexpected alliance they'd formed. Outside, a light snow began to fall, adding another layer to the white blanket that covered their shared wilderness. Dawn brought another cold morning, the kind that made bones ache and breath freeze. Elias hitched the mules to his rough built sled while Agnes wrapped herself in every layer she owned. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as they set out for town, the runners of the sled cutting clean tracks through fresh powder. Need flour, Elias said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since breakfast. Beans, too. Lamp oil's running low. Agnes nodded, her face half hidden in the wool scarf she'd wound around her neck. I can make do with what's in your stores for now, but fresh supplies would help. She paused, then added, I could bake proper bread if we had flour. The journey took most of the morning, the mules picking their way carefully down the slope. By the time they reached Copper Creek, the streets were busy with mid-morning traffic. Elias helped Agnes down from the sled, his strong hand steady at her waist. The mercantile's bell jingled as they entered. Warmth from the pot-bellied stove hit them in a wave, along with the mixed smells of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Agnes headed straight for the dry goods while Elias spoke with Mr. Peterson about ammunition prices. He couldn't help but notice the whispers that followed Agnes as she moved between the shelves. Two women by the fabric bolts hardly bothered to lower their voices. That's her, the giant woodsman's fat bride. Poor man, forced to marry her. No wonder he lives up in that line shack like a hermit. Agnes's back stiffened, but she kept her chin high as she selected a bag of flour. Her cheeks had flushed pink, though, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the beans. Elias felt something twist in his gut. Not quite anger, but close. He stepped closer to Agnes, deliberately, taking the heavy items from her arms. "Found everything you need?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly across the store. "Yes, thank you," she replied with quiet dignity. The whispers died down, replaced by the rustle of fabric as the gossips suddenly found pressing business elsewhere. After settling their account, they crossed the street to the blacksmith shop. The heat from the forge was welcome after the cold, and the familiar ring of hammer on anvil filled the air. While Elias discussed getting new shoes for the mules, the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and Mrs. Clara Halloran, the preacher's wife. "Why, you must be Agnes Grant," Mrs. Halloran said warmly, moving toward Agnes with outstretched hands. "I've been hoping to meet you properly. We're having a quilting circle tomorrow afternoon at the parsonage. You'd be most welcome to join." Elias watched from the corner of his eye, expecting Agnes to decline. To his surprise, she smiled and accepted with genuine warmth. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Halloran. Would it be appropriate to bring something?" "I was thinking of baking pies." "Oh, my dear, that would be lovely. The ladies do enjoy something sweet with their tea." Mrs. Halloran patted Agnes's arm. "And please, call me Clara." As they finished their business with the blacksmith, Elias's keen ears caught a conversation between two Myers warming themselves by the forge. Their voices were low, but clear enough. "Ma says we start putting up the fence next week, around that spring up near Grant's place. Ain't that Indian land? Treaties expired. Besides, who's gonna stop us?" The journey home was quiet, both of them lost in thought as the afternoon light began to fade. The mules knew their way, leaving Elias free to consider what he'd overheard. Beside him, Agnes sat straight back despite the cold, her purchases clutched in her lap. Back at the cabin, Agnes set to work immediately. Soon the small space filled with the smell of baking cornbread and sizzling venison. Elias built up the fire and watched as she moved confidently around the tiny kitchen area, handling his cast iron skillet like she'd been using it for years. "Mrs. Halloran seems kind," she said as she worked, breaking the long silence. "Not everyone in town looks at me like I'm a burden you were forced to bear." She sliced the venison thin, laying it carefully in the hot pan. "I think the quilting circle might be good for me. For us, really. Having friends in town could help with—" She gestured vaguely, but Elias understood she meant their situation with the spring. "Reckon you're right," he said slowly. "Mrs. Halloran's got influence, being the preacher's wife and all." He paused, watching as she pulled the golden cornbread from the oven. "Your pie's likely to win over more folks." A small smile touched Agnes's lips. "My apple pie won first prize at the county fair back home, 3 years running." Elias felt that new respect for her grow stronger. Here was a woman who'd faced downtown gossips with dignity, made allies where he'd expect enemies, and still managed to put a hot meal on his table. She was stronger than she looked, in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. They ate their supper in companionable silence, listening to the soft tick of snow against the windows and the occasional pop from the fireplace. The cornbread was perfect, crisp on the outside, tender within. Even the venison, which Elias usually ate plain, had been seasoned with herbs she'd found dried in his cupboard. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the white wilderness that surrounded them. Inside, the cabin felt warmer. Somehow, as if Annie's quiet determination had kindled something beyond the physical fire that burned in the hearth. 3 days after their trip to town, the winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky as Elias hefted another load of split pine logs. His breath clouded in the cold air while he stacked the wood against the cabin's outer wall. Through the frost-rimmed window, he caught glimpses of Agnes moving purposefully inside, her strong arms lifting and shifting his meager furnishings. The cabin door creaked open, letting out a burst of warm air carrying the scent of soap and pine. Agnes stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing inside. "I've been trying to make things more livable." Elias stepped in, noting the changes. She'd swept every corner clean, arranged his cooking implements on newly installed pegs, and somehow managed to make the small space feel larger. Most notably, she'd tacked one of her quilts over the door, a practical touch that already kept out the worst of the draft. "Don't mind at all," he said, surprised by how much better the cabin looked. "Seems you've got a knack for making something from nothing." Agnes smiled, pleased, but trying not to show it. "There's still daylight left," she said, changing the subject. "Would you mind if I practiced with your old rifle? I should keep my shooting sharp, out here in the wilderness." Elias raised an eyebrow but retrieved his spare Winchester from its place above the door. "You know how to handle this?" "My brother taught me," she said simply, checking the action with practiced movements. "Had to keep the foxes from our chickens?" Back home, they walked behind the cabin where Elias set up some tin cans on a fallen log. The wind had died down, leaving the air crisp and still. Agnes settled the rifle against her shoulder, drew a steady breath, and squeezed the trigger. The can flew backward with a satisfying ping. Elias watched as she worked her way through the remaining targets, missing only 2 shots. Her calm focus impressed him more than her accuracy. Here was yet another surprise from this woman who'd been forced into his life. "Reckon you can handle yourself better than most," he admitted. "A woman alone needs to," she replied, reloading with careful precision. "Even more so now with what we're protecting." Later that afternoon, Agnes hitched a ride into town with Mr. Peterson's wagon, carrying her promised pies to the quilting circle. Elias took the opportunity to visit the telegraph office, his boots crunching on the packed snow of Copper Creek's main street. The operator, Jim Wheeler, looked up from his clicking machine as Elias entered. "Afternoon, Grant. Got some news you might want to hear." He shuffled through papers on his desk. "Mining company filed preliminary paperwork on that spring of yours. Came through yesterday." Elias's jaw tightened. "They're moving fast." "Faster than usual," Wheeler agreed. "Might want to keep an eye out." Meanwhile, in the church basement, Agnes sat among the local women, her fingers working steady at her quilt square. The initial silence had been uncomfortable, broken only by the scratch of needles through fabric. But when she'd opened her basket of fresh-baked apple pies, the atmosphere had shifted. "Land sakes," Mrs. Peterson exclaimed after her first bite. "This is better than my grandmother's recipe." Agnes blushed, pleased. "It's all in how you spice it. Back in Kansas, we had an old apple orchard behind our farm. I used to experiment with different combinations until I got it just right." "Kansas?" Clara Halloran asked, genuine interest in her voice. "What brought you out this way?" As Agnes shared stories about her brother's homestead and their dreams for the land, she noticed the other women leaning in, their faces softening. Even Mrs. Turner, who'd been particularly cold at first, asked questions about life back east. Sun was setting when Elias rode hard back to the cabin, his mule's hooves kicking up snow. He found Agnes lighting the evening lamp, its warm glow spilling across the swept floor. The cabin smelled of beef stew. She'd put the pot on before leaving for town. "The mining companies made their first move," he said without preamble, hanging his coat by the door. "Filed papers on the spring yesterday." Agnes ladled stew into 2 bowls, her movements deliberate as she processed this news. "What do we do now?" They sat at the small table, steam rising between them. Elias broke off a piece of fresh bread. She'd been baking again. "Need to watch the spring daily," he said. "Any sign of trespassing, we reported straight to Marshall. Duggan, he's fair-minded. Won't let them break the law even if they filed papers." "I can help with the watching," Agnes offered. "After seeing how sacred that place is to Tawa's people, and knowing what it meant to my brother." She straightened her shoulders. "I won't let them take it." Elias studied her across the table, seeing again that core of steel beneath her gentle exterior. "We'll take shifts," he agreed. "I can show you the best spots to keep watch without being seen." Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. But inside, the lamplight glowed steady on the swept floors and organized shelves. Agnes's quilt blocked the worst of the draft, and the air held the lingering scent of fresh bread and stew. Looking around, Elias realized the cabin had changed in more ways than just tidiness. With her quiet touches, the arranged dishes, the swept hearth, the carefully placed lamp, Agnes had begun transforming his simple shelter into something else. Something that felt, despite everything, like a home. Dawn painted the snow-covered ground in shades of pink and gold as Elias and Agnes made their way toward the spring. The morning air bit sharp and clean, their boots crunching through the crusty surface of yesterday's snowfall. Agnes pulled her borrowed wool scarf tighter around her neck, keeping pace with Elias's long strides. They smelled the spring before seeing it, that mineral-rich scent cutting through the crisp winter air. But as they approached the ring of cedars, Elias held up one hand, stopping Agnes in her tracks. His eyes narrowed at the disturbed snow around the spring. "Boot tracks," he said quietly, kneeling to examine the prints. 3 men, by the look of it. Fresh from this morning, maybe an hour ago. Agnes moved closer, careful not to disturb the evidence. "How can you tell?" "Edges are still sharp," Elias explained, pointing to the detailed imprints. "Snow hasn't had time to soften them. And see here," he indicated the precise geometric patterns in some of the prints. "Those are surveyors' boots. Special treads for working rough country." The tracks led away from the spring, heading toward the eastern ridge. Elias straightened, adjusting his rifle strap. "Stay behind me," he said. "We'll follow them, see where they've made camp." They tracked the men's path through stands of pine and over rocky outcrops. The sun climbed higher, making the snow brilliantly white. After 20 minutes of careful walking, Elias crouched behind a fallen log, gesturing for Agnes to do the same. Below them, in a natural hollow sheltered by thick pines, 3 canvas tents stood in a neat row. A thin stream of smoke rose from a bank campfire, and surveying equipment, tripods, and brass instruments lay carefully wrapped near the center tent. "Mining company men, sure enough," Elias whispered. "Professional outfit. They're settling in for proper work, not just preliminary surveying." Agnes's mittened hands gripped the rough bark of the log. "How long before they try to fence off the spring?" Back at the cabin, Agnes set to work immediately. Soon the small space filled with the smell of baking cornbread and sizzling venison. Elias built up the fire and watched as she moved confidently around the tiny kitchen area, handling his cast iron skillet like she'd been using it for years. "Mrs. Halloran seems kind," she said as she worked, breaking the long silence. "Not everyone in town looks at me like I'm a burden you were forced to bear." She sliced the venison thin, laying it carefully in the hot pan. "I think the quilting Circle might be good for me. For us, really. Having friends in town could help with... She gestured vaguely, but Elias understood she meant their situation with the spring. Reckon you're right, he said slowly. Mrs. Halloran's got influence, being the preacher's wife and all. He paused, watching as she pulled the golden cornbread from the oven. Your pie's likely to win over more folks. A small smile touched Agnes's lips. My apple pie won first prize at the county fair back home, 3 years running. Elias felt the new respect for her grow stronger. Here was a woman who'd faced downtown gossips with dignity, made all eyes where he'd expect enemies, and still managed to put a hot meal on his table. She was stronger than she looked, in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. They ate their supper in companionable silence, listening to the soft tick of snow against the windows and the occasional pop from the fireplace. The cornbread was perfect, crisp on the outside, tender within. Even the venison, which Elias usually ate plain, had been seasoned with herbs she'd found dried in his cupboard. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the white wilderness that surrounded them. Inside, the cabin felt warmer. Somehow, as if Annie's quiet determination had kindled something beyond the physical fire that burned in the hearth. 3 days after their trip to town, the winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky as Elias hefted another load of split pine logs. His breath clouded in the cold air while he stacked the wood against the cabin's outer wall. Through the frost-rimmed window, he caught glimpses of Agnes moving purposefully inside, her strong arms lifting and shifting his meager furnishings. The cabin door creaked open, letting out a burst of warm air carrying the scent of soap and pine. Agnes stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing inside. I've been trying to make things more livable. Elias stepped in, noting the changes. She'd swept every corner clean, arranged his cooking implements on newly installed pegs, and somehow managed to make the small space feel larger. Most notably, she'd tacked one of her quilts over the door, a practical touch that already kept out the worst of the draft. Don't mind at all, he said, surprised by how much better the cabin looked. Seems you've got a knack for making something from nothing. Agnes smiled, pleased, but trying not to show it. There's still daylight left, she said, changing the subject. Would you mind if I practiced with your old rifle? I should keep my shooting sharp, out here in the wilderness. Elias raised an eyebrow but retrieved his spare Winchester from its place above the door. You know how to handle this? My brother taught me, she said simply, checking the action with practiced movements. Had to keep the foxes from our chickens? Back home, they walked behind the cabin where Elias set up some tin cans on a fallen log. The wind had died down, leaving the air crisp and still. Agnes settled the rifle against her shoulder, drew a steady breath, and squeezed the trigger. The can flew backward with a satisfying ping. Elias watched as she worked her way through the remaining targets, missing only 2 shots. Her calm focus impressed him more than her accuracy. Here was yet another surprise from this woman who'd been forced into his life. Reckon you can handle yourself better than most, he admitted. A woman alone needs to, she replied, reloading with careful precision. Even more so now with what we're protecting. Later that afternoon, Agnes hitched a ride into town with Mr. Peterson's wagon, carrying her promised pies to the quilting circle. Elias took the opportunity to visit the telegraph office, his boots crunching on the packed snow of Copper Creek's main street. The operator, Jim Wheeler, looked up from his clicking machine as Elias entered. Afternoon, Grant. Got some news you might want to hear. He shuffled through papers on his desk. Mining company filed preliminary paperwork on that spring of yours. Came through yesterday. Elias's jaw tightened. They're moving fast. Faster than usual, Wheeler agreed. Might want to keep an eye out. Meanwhile, in the church basement, Agnes sat among the local women, her fingers working steady at her quilt square. The initial silence had been uncomfortable, broken only by the scratch of needles through fabric. But when she'd opened her basket of fresh-baked apple pies, the atmosphere had shifted. "Land sakes," Mrs. Peterson exclaimed after her first bite. "This is better than my grandmother's recipe." Agnes blushed, pleased. "It's all in how you spice it. Back in Kansas, we had an old apple orchard behind our farm. I used to experiment with different combinations until I got it just right." "Kansas?" Clara Halloran asked, genuine interest in her voice. "What brought you out this way?" As Agnes shared stories about her brother's homestead and their dreams for the land, she noticed the other women leaning in, their faces softening. Even Mrs. Turner, who'd been particularly cold at first, asked questions about life back east. Sun was setting when Elias rode hard back to the cabin, his mule's hooves kicking up snow. He found Agnes lighting the evening lamp, its warm glow spilling across the swept floor. The cabin smelled of beef stew. She'd put the pot on before leaving for town. "The mining companies made their first move," he said without preamble, hanging his coat by the door. "Filed papers on the spring yesterday." Agnes ladled stew into 2 bowls, her movements deliberate as she processed this news. "What do we do now?" They sat at the small table, steam rising between them. Elias broke off a piece of fresh bread. She'd been baking again. "Need to watch the spring daily," he said. "Any sign of trespassing, we reported straight to Marshall. Duggan, he's fair-minded. Won't let them break the law even if they filed papers." "I can help with the watching," Agnes offered. "After seeing how sacred that place is to Tawa's people and knowing what it meant to my brother." She straightened her shoulders. "I won't let them take it." Elias studied her across the table, seeing again that core of steel beneath her gentle exterior. "We'll take shifts," he agreed. "I can show you the best spots to keep watch without being seen." Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. But inside, the lamplight glowed steady on the swept floors and organized shelves. Agnes's quilt blocked the worst of the draft, and the air held the lingering scent of fresh bread and stew. Looking around, Elias realized the cabin had changed in more ways than just tidiness. With her quiet touches, the arranged dishes, the swept hearth, the carefully placed lamp, Agnes had begun transforming his simple shelter into something else. Something that felt, despite everything, like a home. Dawn painted the snow-covered ground in shades of pink and gold as Elias and Agnes made their way toward the spring. The morning air bit sharp and clean, their boots crunching through the crusty surface of yesterday's snowfall. Agnes pulled her borrowed wool scarf tighter around her neck, keeping pace with Elias's long strides. They smelled the spring before seeing it, that mineral-rich scent cutting through the crisp winter air. But as they approached the ring of cedars, Elias held up one hand, stopping Agnes in her tracks. His eyes narrowed at the disturbed snow around the spring. "Boot tracks," he said quietly, kneeling to examine the prints. 3 men, by the look of it. Fresh from this morning, maybe an hour ago. Agnes moved closer, careful not to disturb the evidence. "How can you tell?" "Edges are still sharp," Elias explained, pointing to the detailed imprints. "Snow hasn't had time to soften them. And see here," he indicated the precise geometric patterns in some of the prints. "Those are surveyors' boots. Special treads for working rough country." The tracks led away from the spring, heading toward the eastern ridge. Elias straightened, adjusting his rifle strap. "Stay behind me," he said. "We'll follow them, see where they've made camp." They tracked the men's path through stands of pine and over rocky outcrops. The sun climbed higher, making the snow brilliantly white. After 20 minutes of careful walking, Elias crouched behind a fallen log, gesturing for Agnes to do the same. Below them, in a natural hollow sheltered by thick pines, 3 canvas tents stood in a neat row. A thin stream of smoke rose from a bank campfire, and surveying equipment, tripods, and brass instruments lay carefully wrapped near the center tent. "Mining company men, sure enough," Elias whispered. "Professional outfit. They're settling in for proper work, not just preliminary surveying." And as his mittened hands gripped the rough bark of the log, "How long before they try to fence off the spring?" "The spring won't be long. They'll want to establish control before spring thaw brings more travelers through." He touched her elbow lightly. "Let's head back. Need to plan on next move." They returned to the cabin as morning shifted toward noon. Agnes immediately stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil, her movements quick and precise. While they warmed themselves, they discussed options, watching in shifts, documenting any illegal actions, building their own claim markers. The short winter day faded quickly into evening. Agnes prepared a simple supper of beans and bacon, the familiar scents filling the cabin's single room. They ate in companionable silence until Agnes looked up from her plate. "How long have you been working these mountains?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. Elias paused, fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. "Since I was 13. Parents died of fever that spring. Had an uncle running trap lines up here. Took me in, taught me the trade." He cleared his throat. "Been doing it ever since." Agnes nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My brother raised me too, after we lost our parents. He was 18, I was just 10. She smiled softly at the memory. "Taught himself to bake bread, so I wouldn't go without. Wasn't very good at first. We had some mighty strange suppers those early days." "Your brother sounds like a good man." He was. And as his voice held both pride and sadness, worked himself too hard, trying to make that homestead prosper. His heart gave out last winter. She straightened her shoulders. "That's why I can't let them take his spring." It meant everything to him seeing it give life to the land, helping travelers, knowing it would be there for future generations. The quiet between them felt different now, weighted with shared understanding. The fire popped and hissed, throwing warm light across their faces. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the lonely sound of coyotes in the distance. A knock at the door startled them both. Elias reached for his rifle, but Agnes recognized the pattern: 3 soft taps, a pause, then 2 more. "It's Tawa," she said, already moving to open the door. The elderly Ute man stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air and the rich smell of smoked meat. He carried a leather bundle, which he placed carefully on the table. "Venison," he said, unwrapping it. "Smoked with juniper, but I bring warning too." He accepted the cup of coffee Agnes offered, warming his hand around it. Company men are moving fast. They know the treaties, know they must act before spring brings territorial officials through. Elias nodded grimly. "We saw their camp today. 3 surveyors, professional outfit. More will come," Tawa said. "They always do." He sipped his coffee, considering. "The spring has been sacred to my people since before your government drew its maps. The treaties recognize this. The papers mean little to men who want gold." Agnes sat down across from him, her face serious. "What can we do? Surely the treaties give us some protection?" "Treaties protect those strong enough to enforce them," Tawa replied. "But yes, they give us weapons of paper to match their weapons of steel. I have sent word to our tribal council. They will send men who know the law, who can speak in your courts." He looked at both of them. "But you must hold the spring until they come." They talked late into the evening, Tawa sharing stories of the spring's history, of summers long past when his people gathered there for ceremonies of healing and renewal. Agnes listened intently, asking careful questions about the treaties and tribal rights, while Elias added logs to the fire. The flames burned low by the time Tawa rose to leave. He pulled his blanket closer around his shoulders, but paused at the door. "You are good people," he said simply. "The spring has chosen well in bringing you together to protect it." After he left, Agnes and Elias sat in thoughtful silence. The fire's dying light caught the determination in Agnes's eyes, the quiet strength in Elias's set jaw. Whatever came next, they would face it together, forced marriage becoming willing partnership in defense of something larger than themselves. The week passed in a familiar rhythm. Each morning, Elias and Agnes rode out to check the spring, watching for fresh tracks or survey markers. The routine brought an unexpected comfort-sharing coffee at dawn, discussing their plans during the rides, working together to protect what mattered. When Sunday arrived, Agnes stood at their small mirror, pinning her hair with careful attention. "We should go to church today," she said, meeting Elias's reflection behind her. Elias paused in cleaning his boots. "Don't reckon the town's ready for that. They'll never be ready if we hide up here." Agnes turned, her eyes gentle but determined. "Besides, it's the right thing to do." Something in her quiet conviction made argument impossible. Elias nodded, reaching for his cleanest shirt, a faded blue cotton thing he usually saved for trips. To Denver. Agnes smoothed her own dress, dark brown wool that brought out the warmth in her eyes. The small church looked different in morning light, its pine walls glowing honey gold. As they entered, conversation died. Elias felt the weight of stairs as he guided Agnes to a pew near the back, his large frame making the wooden bench creak. Mrs. Halloran nodded to them from 3 rows ahead, but others quickly turned away. Elias sat stiff-backed, uncomfortable, in his good shirt, until Agnes touched his arm gently. "Just breathe," she whispered. The preacher began the service, and soon it was time for hymns. When Amazing Grace was announced, Agnes stood with the others. Her voice rose clear and strong, a rich alto that filled the small sanctuary with unexpected beauty. The whispers that had haunted the corners fell silent. Elias watched sideways as she sang, noting how the sunlight through the windows caught the auburn highlights in her hair. Her face held a peace he hadn't seen before, and something in his chest tightened at the sight. After the final Amen, people filed out into the cold morning. Mrs. Halloran approached them, her kind face creased in a smile. "That was lovely singing." "Agnes," she turned to Elias, her eyes twinkling. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Grant. Not many can bring such music to these mountains." Elias shifted, unused to such direct address. "Yes, ma'am," he managed. "Reckon I am." The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought. Back at the cabin, they fell into their afternoon tasks. Elias headed to the corral, tools in hand. The fence. Rails needed mending. Winter storms had loosened several posts. Inside, Agnes mixed flour and yeast, kneading dough with practiced movements. The familiar work soothed her, and soon the cabin filled with the warm scent of baking bread. Elias worked steadily, measuring twice before cutting replacement rails, testing each repair with careful attention. The physical labor helped settle his mind after the morning's social tensions. From time to time, he glanced at the cabin, watching smoke curl from the chimney. Catching whiffs of fresh bread on the window as evening approached, they gathered at their small table. Agnes served thick slices of warm bread with beans and salt. Pork. Steam rose from their cups of coffee, carrying away the day's chill. "Do you miss it?" Elias asked suddenly. "Kansas, I mean." Agnes considered the question, breaking her bread thoughtfully. "No," she said finally. "Oh, I miss some things. The spring wildflowers, the way storms roll in across the prairie." She met his eyes. "But here's where the fight is. Here's where I'm needed." The simple truth of her words hung in the air between them. After supper, Agnes brewed tea, a special blend Mrs. Halloran had given her. They sat before the fire, the quiet ease of their evening routine settling around them like a familiar blanket. Elias watched the flames dance, aware of Agnes's presence beside him, her hands wrapped around her teacup. The forced marriage that had started as a trap now felt different, not quite a choice, but no longer a burden either. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, an owl called into the gathering night, its voice echoing off the snow-covered slopes. Inside the cabin, two people who had been strangers sat in comfortable silence, sharing warmth and purpose, finding unexpected peace in their shared mission. The late February sun worked steadily at the snowdrifts, creating a patchwork of white and brown across the mountainside. Water trickled down rock faces that had been ice-locked just days before, and the morning air carried the first hints of spring thaw. Elias and Agnes made their daily ride to check the spring, their mules picking careful paths through the softening ground. As they rounded the last bend, Elias pulled his mount to a sharp halt. Agnes gasped beside him. A neat line of fence posts lay on the ground, stretching from cedar to cedar around the spring. The wooden posts were fresh-cut pine, their pale surfaces still sticky with sap. Someone had hauled them up here overnight, laying out their claim plain as day. "They're moving fast," Agnes said, her voice tight with worry. She dismounted, touching one of the posts with trembling fingers. Elias swung down from his saddle, jaw clenched. Without a word, he began gathering the posts, his movements sharp with anger. One by one, he carried them to a steep slope away from the spring. "They'll nose you," Agnes warned, but she was already helping, her skirts gathered in one hand as she dragged posts through melting snow. "Let them know." Elias's voice was low and dangerous. "This is still your land." Together they worked, clearing away every marker of the mining company's intentions. When the last post tumbled down the slope, Elias stood for a long moment, staring at the spring. The water burbled peacefully over rocks, unaware of the battle brewing around it. Agnes touched his arm. "We should head back. Storm's coming." She pointed west, where dark clouds were building over the peaks. They rode home in tense silence, both knowing they'd crossed a line. The mining company wouldn't take kindly to such direct defiance. Evening settled early, pushed by the approaching storm. Agnes had just lit the lamp when hoofbeats sounded outside. Elias reached for his rifle, but the rider called out clearly, "Message for Mrs. Grant." Through the window, they saw a young boy from the telegraph office, holding up an envelope. Elias opened the door, and the kid handed over a sealed packet, official-looking with its territorial court stamp. "Much obliged," Elias said, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. The messenger touched his hat and rode off, eager to beat the weather hone. Inside, Agnes's hands shook as she broke the seal. Her face went pale as she read, the paper crinkling in her grip. "What is it?" Elias asked, moving closer. "They're saying..." Agnes swallowed hard. "They're saying our marriage isn't legal. That I'm already married." She looked up at him, eyes wide with shock. To a man in Kansas. Elias took the paper, reading quickly. The formal language declared their marriage invalid on grounds of existing matrimony, citing testimony from one Thomas Whitaker of Lawrence, Kansas, who claimed Agnes as his legal wife. "I don't understand," Agnes whispered. "I've never been married." "Before?" "Never." She sank into a chair, her usual strength crumbling. Then her head snapped up, memory flooding her face. "Unless, oh Lord, unless they found out about Tom." "Tell me," Elias said quietly, pulling up the other chair. "It was years ago, before my brother died." Agnes twisted her hands in her lap. "Tom Whitaker worked at the Mercantile in Lawrence. He said we were married. Told everyone we'd file papers, but we hadn't. When I found out he had another woman in Topeka." She drew a shaky breath. "I left, came west with my brother. It was no real marriage, Elias. No papers were ever filed." Thunder rolled outside as Elias digested this. The mining company must have found him, convinced him to sign something. His voice hardened. Bought him, more likely. What do we do? Agnes asked, fear clear in her voice. Elias stood, pacing the small cabin. We ride to Gunnison tomorrow. First light. The territorial court's there. We'll clear your name. Prove this Whitaker's lying. But the spring won't matter if they invalidate our marriage. They'll take the land anyway. He stopped pacing, meeting her worried gaze. We have to fight this first. Agnes nodded slowly, her chin lifting with returning determination. I'll pack provisions tonight, but nature had other plans. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, bringing howling wind and heavy, wet snow. The temperature dropped sharply, and soon the windows rattled with sleet. We can't travel in this, Elias said, adding wood to the fire. Have to wait it out. Agnes stood at the window, watching ice coat the glass. They planned this well, she said bitterly. Every day we're delayed gives them more time to move on the spring. Elias touched her shoulder gently. We'll leave as soon as it breaks. I promise you, Agnes, we'll fight this, together. She turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry about Tom, about not telling you sooner. I never thought. You've nothing to be sorry for, Elias said firmly. Some men's lies don't reflect on those they hurt. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, they sat close to the fire, planning their journey to Gunnison, sharing what they knew of territorial law. As the evening wore on, their determination grew stronger. Whatever the mining company thought they'd accomplished with this latest move, they'd soon learn that neither Elias nor Agnes gave up easily. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, and sleet ticked against the windows like tiny bullets, but they barely heard it. They were too busy preparing for the fight ahead, knowing that everything, their marriage, the spring, the sacred land it fed now, hung by a thread that only truth could mend. The storm settled in like an unwelcome guest, howling and rattling at the cabin walls. Snow piled against the windows until only a gray light filtered through. Inside, Elias and Agnes adapted to their confinement, marking time by the dwindling stack of firewood and the careful portioning of their supplies. Best save the bacon, Agnes said on the first morning, measuring coffee beans with careful precision. No telling how long this will last. Elias nodded, already calculating how many days their stores might stretch. He'd wintered alone before, but having another mouth to feed changed everything. Still, watching Agnes calmly organize their resources, he felt a flicker of admiration. She showed no panic, just practical good sense. They fell into a rhythm as the hours stretched on. Elias kept the fire fed, melted snow for water, and worked at mending their gear. His big hands grew nimble with small tasks, fixing a loose stirrup, patching a hole in his wool coat, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. Agnes, meanwhile, turned her attention to the cabin itself. She'd found a stack of empty flour sacks in the lean-to, and now she washed them in melted snow, hanging them near the fire to dry. What are those for? Elias asked, looking up from his work. Curtains, she replied, measuring the clean sacks against the window frame. These windows need something better than old gunny sacks. He watched her work, impressed by how she made do with what they had. The flour sacks, once cleaned and pressed, took on a fresh whiteness that brightened the whole cabin. On the second day, they shared stories over their rationed meals. Agnes told him about learning to shoot from her brother, about the garden she'd kept in Kansas, about the first time she'd seen mountains rising on the horizon. Never thought I'd end up living in them, she said, gazing out at the white world beyond their windows. But now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Elias found himself talking too, more than he had in years. He described his early days on the trapline, the lessons learned from old mountain men, the seasons spent in high country solitude. Wasn't always easy, he admitted, but it was simple, clear. He paused, studying the fire. Things aren't so simple anymore. Agnes looked at him quietly, understanding in her eyes. No, she said softly, they're not. By the third day, the storm showed no signs of weakening, but something else had changed. The silence between them had grown comfortable, filled with small gestures of consideration. Elias noticed how Agnes always had coffee ready when he came in from checking the animals. She noticed how he'd hung her wet stockings where they dry fastest, near the chimney's warmth. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias found himself watching her mend a tear in one of his shirts. Her strong hands moved surely with the needle, her face peaceful in the firelight. Something shifted in his chest, a recognition that she'd become more than just the woman he'd been forced to marry. She was a partner now, one he'd chosen to stand beside. Agnes, he said quietly. She looked up, needle poised. Yes, I'm glad you're here. The words came out rough but honest. Not just for the spring's sake anymore. Color rose in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. I'm glad too, she said, and went back to her sewing with a small smile. On the morning of the fourth day, they woke to silence. The wind had died in the night, and weak sunlight pushed through the flower-sack curtains. Elias opened the door to find the world-transformed snow lay deep and pristine, the sky above a sharp Colorado blue. Time to ride, he said, coming back inside where Agnes was already packing food for his journey. She nodded, wrapping bread and jerky in a clean cloth. The bread's 3 days old, but it'll keep. There's dried apples, too. They worked together to prepare for his departure, both aware of the urgency driving them. The mining company had already had 3 days to push their false claims. Every hour mattered now. Elias saddled his best mule while Agnes brought out his warmest coat, newly mended. The morning air bit cold and clean, their breath forming clouds in the sunshine. I'll bring back proof, Elias promised, securing his saddlebags. Whatever it takes to clear your name. Agnes stood straight and strong, her chin lifted. I know you will. She handed him the packet of food. Just come back safe. He swung into the saddle, adjusting his rifle in its scabbard. The mule shifted. Beneath him, eager to move after days of stillness. Elias looked down at Agnes, seeing determination match his own in her steady gaze. 3 days to Gunnison, he said. Maybe 4 in this snow. I'll send word when I can. Agnes nodded, stepping back from the mule. The sun caught her hair, turning it to copper and gold, and Elias carried that image with him as he turned his mount toward the trail. Snow crunched under the mule's hooves as they picked their way down the slope. Elias looked back once, seeing Agnes still standing by the cabin door. She raised her hand in farewell, a small figure against the white landscape, but straight-backed and strong. Even from a distance, he could see she had no intention of backing down from this fight. The cabin grew smaller behind him as he rode, until it was just a dark shape against the snow. But Elias felt its pull, knew it held something worth coming back to. Not just the spring anymore, not just the sacred land they'd promised to protect. Something more precious had grown in that cabin during the storm, something worth fighting for with everything he had. He turned his face toward Gunnison, letting the mule find its footing in the deep snow. Behind him lay Agnes and their home. Ahead lay justice, if he could find it. The sun climbed higher, making the snow-covered world sparkle like diamonds, as Elias Grant rode out to defend what had started as a marriage of necessity, but had become something far more real. The mountain trail wound through deep snow, slowing Elias's progress to a careful pace. His mule picked its way between ice-slicked rocks and hidden hollows, steam rising from its flanks despite the cold. By sunset of the second day, the lights of Miller's Way Station glimmered ahead like fallen stars. The stable boy took his mule. as Elias stamped snow from his boots. Inside, the common room hummed with quiet conversation and wood smoke. A familiar figure sat near the fire, Marshal Henry Duggan, his badge catching lamplight. "Grant," the marshal mouted, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Long way from your hunting grounds." Elias settled his bulk into the creaking chair, accepting a cup of coffee from the innkeeper's wife. "Got trouble, Marshal?" "Mining companies trying to void my marriage with false papers." Over bowls of hot stew, Elias explained everything. The forced marriage, Agnes's brother's land, the sacred spring, and now the company's claim about a previous husband. Marshal Duggan listened, his weathered face thoughtful. "Judge Horace Wilburn's in Gunnison now," Duggan said finally. "Straight as they come. He'll hear you fair, but you'll need more than just your word." Morning found Elias in Judge Wilburn's courthouse, hat in hand. The judge, thin as a rail but sharp-eyed, listened to Agnes's written account and Elias's testimony about the mining company's pressure. "Your wife's character speaks well through her words," Judge Wilburn said. "But the law requires witnesses. This Kansas marriage claim is serious. Who can speak to your wife's truth?" "Mrs. Clara Halloran, the preacher's wife," Elias replied. "She knows Agnes well. And Tawa, a Ute elder who understands the spring's importance. The railroad agent in Copper Creek, too. He's seen the mining company's dealings firsthand." The judge nodded slowly. "Send your telegrams. I'll hold judgment until I hear from them." At the telegraph office, Elias carefully counted out coins for 3 messages, each urgent but clear. To Mrs. Halloran, asking her to testify to Agnes's character and their marriage's legitimacy. To Tawa, through the Indian agent, requesting his knowledge of the spring and treaty rights. To the railroad agent, seeking confirmation of the mining company's suspicious patterns. That night, Elias bedded down in Judge Wilburn's barn, his saddle for a pillow. The hay was fresh and warm, but sleep came slowly. He thought of Agnes alone at the cabin, defending their home. Of the spring, sacred to the Ute and vital to the town. Of the simple gold ring on his finger that had come to mean so much more than a forced arrangement. Tomorrow, he would wait for answers. Tonight, he prayed the witnesses would come through in time. Agnes stood at the cabin window, watching dawn creep over the snow-dusted pines. Steam rose from her coffee cup, warming her hands as she surveyed their small homestead. The morning ritual of checking the spring couldn't wait, no matter how her heart ached with Elias's absence. Bundled against the mountain chill, she traced the familiar path through melting drifts. The spring burbled beneath thin ice, clear as ever. Agnes knelt, breaking the frost's delicate skin to test the water's flow. Satisfied, she marked another day in her mental ledger of protecting this precious resource. Back at the cabin, she threw herself into work. The familiar rhythm of kneading bread dough settled her nerves. By midday, 4 golden loaves cooled on the rough-hewn table. The scent of fresh bread filled the small space, reminding her of the growing bonds she'd built with her neighbors. Loading 2 loaves into her basket, Agnes made her way down the trail to town. Mrs. Halloran welcomed her with a warm embrace at the parsonage door. "Child, you look worn to the bone," the preacher's wife said, ushering her inside. "Come, sit. I've just brewed tea." Over steaming cups, Agnes shared her worries about the court challenge. Mrs. Halloran reached across the table, clasping Agnes's work-roughened hands in her own. "I'll testify to the truth of your marriage," she declared firmly. "The whole town's seen how you and Elias have grown together. No false paper from Kansas can undo that." The sun hung low when Agnes started home, her spirit lifted by the visit. But halfway up the trail, hoofbeats approached. A miner she recognized from town reined his horse alongside her. "Best pack up before the thaw, Mrs. Grant," he said, his tone carrying an unmistakable threat. Company don't take kindly to claim jumpers. Agnes lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. This is my home, sir. I ain't leaving. The miner spurred his horse, spraying snow as he turned away. Agnes's hands trembled as she unlocked the cabin door, but her voice was steady as she lit the evening lamp and knelt by the bed. Lord, watch over Elias, she prayed aloud into the gathering darkness. Keep him safe on his journey. Give us both strength to defend what's right. She woke at first light to the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across the valley. Her heart seized as she rushed to the window, scanning the tree line for movement. More shots rang out, distant but clear. Agnes gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white. Please, she whispered, please let him be safe. Morning light filtered throughGunnison's courthouse windows as Elias paced the wooden floors, his boots echoing in the empty corridor. Snow had delayed his witnesses, but now, one by one, they arrived. Shaking off winter's chill dot, Mrs. Halloran swept in first, her gray hair dusted with snowflakes. She carried a bundle of church records documenting the marriage ceremony. Behind her came Tawa, wrapped in a wool blanket against the cold, his weathered face solemn. The railroad agent, Marcus Wheeler, hurried in last, clutching a leather portfolio stuffed with telegraph correspondence. Judge Horace called them to order. His gavel cracked sharp in the quiet chamber. This court will hear testimony regarding the validity of marriage between Elias Grant and Agnes Pruitt, he announced. Adjusting his spectacles, Mrs. Halloran spoke first, her voice steady. I witnessed their vows myself, she testified. They've worked that land together, shared a home. Their marriage may have started under pressure, but it's grown into something true. Tawa stood next, speaking with quiet dignity. The spring lies on treaty land, he explained. We agreed to share it with honest settlers who would protect it. Elias Grant and his wife honored this agreement. Wheeler spread documents across the judge's desk. These telegrams show the mining company's pattern of fraud, he declared. They've forged claims before, trying to steal water rights across 3 territories. Judge Horace studied each paper carefully, his expression grave. Hours passed as he reviewed the evidence. Elias's hands clenched and unclenched, his only sign of tension. Finally, the judge looked up. This court finds no merit in the challenge to this marriage, he pronounced. The union between Elias Grant and Agnes Pruitt stands legal and binding. Furthermore, their claim to the spring is valid under territorial law. He fixed his stern gaze on the mining company's lawyer. The sheriff will enforce this ruling. Relief washed over Elias. He shook hands with Wheeler, clasped Tawa's shoulder in thanks, and accepted Mrs. Halloran's warm embrace. But dark clouds gathering outside urged him homeward. God speed you safely to Agnes, Mrs. Halloran said, pressing a wrapped loaf of bread into his hands. Elias mounted his mule as snow began falling. The storm grew fiercer as he rode, wind howling through canyon walls. He thought of Agnes waiting, probably worried sick, and urged his mount faster through the deepening drifts. The precious court order lay safe in his coat pocket, close to his heart. Dusk painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of purple when Elias finally spotted smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. His mule, exhausted from the journey, trudged the final steps through knee-deep snow. Before he could dismount, the cabin door burst open. Agnes rushed out, her coat flapping in the wind, her cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. Elias, she called, running toward him. Her boots crunched through the crusty snow as she approached. Careful now, he warned, climbing down stiffly, grounds treacherous with ice. She reached for his cold-numbed hands. You're frozen through. Come inside, quick. She led both him and the mule to shelter, helping him stable the tired animal before hurrying him into the cabin's welcoming warmth. The fire crackled invitingly in the hearth. and the rich aroma of beef stew filled the small space. Agnes ladled generous portions into tin bowls while Elias shed his snow-crusted coat and boots. "Tell me everything," she urged, passing him a steaming bowl and settling beside him at their rough-hewn table. Between spoonfuls of hot stew, Elias recounted the court proceedings. Judge Horace ruled in our favor. The marriage stands legal, and our claim to the spring is protected. He pulled the court order from his coat pocket, carefully unfolding the precious document. Agnes's eyes welled with tears as she read the judge's flowing script. "Thank the Lord," she whispered. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They rode into town together, Agnes seated securely behind Elias on his mule. The church hall buzzed with conversation as townsfolk gathered to hear the official announcement. Judge Horace stood at the front, his voice carrying to every corner as he read the ruling. When he finished, silence fell over the assembled crowd. Elias rose slowly to his feet, drawing himself up to his full height. His voice, usually so quiet, rang out strong and clear. "This woman is my wife by law, by God's grace, and by my own choice." He turned to face Agnes, his expression softened with genuine affection, "and I'm proud to call her mine." Applause erupted. Through the hall, Mrs. Halloran wiped tears from her eyes, and even Sheriff Reddick, standing near the back, tipped his hat in acknowledgement. Agnes's face glowed with joy as she stood beside her husband. Their hands clasped together. The townsfolk pressed forward to offer congratulations, and Agnes's fresh-baked pies, brought for the occasion, were shared among friends old and new. What had begun as a marriage of necessity had grown into something far more precious, a union of hearts, blessed by law and community alike. Spring painted the valley in vibrant colors as wildflowers dotted the meadows around their cabin. Agnes's garden flourished behind the neat rail fence Elias had built, rows of green shoots promising summer bounty. Already her early lettuce and peas supplied not just their own table, but those of neighbors down in the valley dotted the sacred spring. Ute families gathered freely to pray and collect water, nodding respectfully to Agnes as she tended her washing or to Elias as he mended fences nearby. The ancient cedars whispered peace over the clear water in the small church where they'd first been joined. Agnes and Elias stood before their friends once more. This time, their eyes shone with joy as they clasped hands, renewing their vows. With genuine smiles. Through the windows, late spring snowflakes drifted lazily, though the air held the warmth of coming summer. Walking home arm in arm, Agnes looked up at her husband. "You never were forced," she whispered, her voice gentle. Elias squeezed her hand. "No," he agreed softly. "I was chosen." As evening settled over the mountains, they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in gold and rose. Their shared silence spoke of deep contentment, mutual respect, and a love that had grown as naturally as Agnes's garden from the rocky soil of their beginning. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.